Cheers! What's up? How's it going? For friends who need it, we're gonna do this first because I'm gonna forget otherwise. I am a white young person with light brown hair that is in 2 French braids, and I'm sitting in front of a plain wall that has green leaves on it, and I'm wearing a Frog and Toad t-shirt that you can't see because of how the camera is, but it does have Frog and Toad on it, and it's really great and really gay. And then I'm wearing a red and black plaid, I guess it's plaid, flannel on top. Today we're going to talk about the history of disability in children's literature because to me that feels like a bit of a research blind spot of sorts, but it's a very crucial one in understanding legacies of media because, well, most people are raised on children's literature, so it is very formative in how we see the world as adults and also what kind of media we then create as adults. So analyzing the things upon which we grew up is very, very important in unpacking harmful mindsets and all of the other things like that. And obviously if I'm going to try to fill a research blind spot for myself, I'm going to share with you guys because that gives me more motivation to be thorough with it. But then I couldn't find a ton of research about the history of disability in children's literature because people rarely take children's literature seriously, so that field is pretty small, and then disability studies is also a pretty small field, so the overlap is even tinier. So the plan is today to talk about the history of children's literature, and then I will add in disability context later, and it's going to be a great time because I'm not gonna let perfection be the enemy of good. Also, what better time of the year to talk about nostalgia and childhood than just before Christmas? I also want to give 2 specific source shout outs. Both are books. The first is called Children's Literature, A Reader's History from Aesop to Harry Potter by Seth Lehrer, that traces not just the history of children's literature in the sense of a timeline of books that existed, but also how those directly connect to the political views of what childhood was at the time. This video is going to be heavily based and molded around the structure and concept that was that book, but I do highly recommend giving it a read because there are so many pieces of it that were super interesting that simply will not make it into this video. And the second source that I want to shout out is Disfigured on Fairy Tales, Disability Making Space by Amanda Leduc. It's part memoir, part literary analysis about how views of disability that exist in children's literature, particularly in the fairy tale, directly impact Amanda's life and view of herself as a disabled person, and that will more inform the latter portion of this video. Now, the first thing to get out of the way before we dive into the history is that the academic field of children's literature has many of the same quirks we see in many other fields of history and literature, primarily that it's very Eurocentric, and that it is an expansive history where we see general trends over periods of time, but the dates for each sort of era are super vague and heavily overlap with one another, especially when it comes to the arts, because everything sort of builds on what existed before, so you can often find like cookie cutter examples of something from a former era in a later era. The children's literature book that was my primary source for this video went more based on concept than on specific historical timeline, as did many of the articles that I read, and very few of those dates lined up, but the concepts more or less did. So please take all of this more or less with a slight grain of salt. We're going for ideas and ideals and patterns more than precise accuracy here because nobody can agree on what accuracy is, and I would argue that there isn't technically any accuracy here, which personally stresses me out a lot, but you know what, we move. Discussions of children's literature also inevitably include an argument around what actually constitutes literature, because that's also not as cookie cutter as people think, because literature is not limited to written text, which is important given how much early classrooms focused on oration, recitation, and performance. I will also note, though it won't really come into conversation in this video, but it's in its vein and I think it's important, deaf literature is almost exclusively signed performance rather than written text. Thus the discussion of children's literary history often boils down to what do we include as the classics, or as indicative of wider themes as to what counts and doesn't count as a part of that history, which inherently takes a discussion of something living and breathing and tries to standardize it and academize it, and also inevitably prioritizes the works that have survived over ones that went out of print or that we don't otherwise have that much extant knowledge of, which is going to skew things to some degree. The last thing to note is that discussions of children's literature also have to ask, what is childhood? And in looking at historical views of childhood, those are inherently shaded by our current view of what childhood is, or more specifically, how the education system and politics around children change, since we tend to equate schooling with childhood. And children's literature has always existed, even if it didn't really become an explicitly separate category for quite some time. Much of what we now see as children's literature are stories and fables and pieces of folklore that were originally created for all ages of listeners. Much of what we view today as being ancient children's literature is in fact just literature that was believed culturally important enough that children should know it and was thus put into their classrooms. So where children's literature really finds a start is actually just in storytelling itself, which, to simplify, vastly became curriculum, which then led to stories being written specifically for curriculum, which then led to stories being written to be curriculum outside of the classroom. Even the seemingly silly, useless stories still find their roots there, given that having something fun to read encourages the skill of reading, which is curriculum. Some of the earliest stories that we see today as children's stories are Aesop's Fables, which had their first collection around the 4th century BCE, but are probably older, and the Panchatantra, a collection of Sanskrit animal fables first dated to about 200 BCE that are also probably a whole lot older than that. There are, of course, folk tales and whatnot beyond that. Those are just the two things most often cited as the first children's literature. Other things that have always existed, not just as a part of children's literature, but more generally, are illustrations to go along with text. There are extant papyri from Byzantine Egypt telling the stories of Hercules that include illustrations, and manuscripts from the Middle Ages often including visuals of scenes, small drawings around the text, and large and ornate initial letters of chapters or pages or stories. Another thing I find really interesting in this realm is that Middle Ages manuscripts often attached extra things to them to illustrate math concepts or anatomy or other things, so functionally the pop-up book has been around for hundreds of years. Also, various animal sounds as a way to teach grammar has been a thing since ancient Rome, which also brought me joy. Now, Aesop was a cool dude. Well, there's a lot of theories as to whether he was actually a real dude or just like a name people used to attribute to various animal-related moral-based stories. If he did exist, he was likely an enslaved person, and some sources say he was also a physically disabled person, which I think is cool. But honestly, we don't know. It doesn't totally matter, but also, like, to me it kind of does. Anyway, Aesop's fables, I would assume, along with things like Homer, Ovid, and Horace, existed right on this major cusp of the shift between oral storytelling and written works, especially as they became used very heavily in classrooms and to some degree continue to be up until today, which I find quite interesting. They decided in ancient Rome and ancient Greece that these are the works children must learn, and that everybody else since then went, well, they read all these before, so I guess that we should too, which kind of warms my heart for some reason that like everybody is raised in the same stories. I was never taught all of those, but we did cover some of Ovid and the Odyssey in like 10th grade English, and I distinctly remember learning about Aesop's fables in like the 2nd grade, which just feels wholesome and like it's connecting a lot of humanity in a way that I just think is really nice. There is something to be said about childhood being the one universal language that we have, and I think having this be a part of that. Anyway, another interesting thing about Aesop's fables is that ever since the very beginning of them becoming written texts, they have been rewritten and republished so many times to serve different purposes based on what the writer of them thought were the important things to emphasize. Some to be more literary and complicated to encourage critical thinking, some to be more clear in meaning, some to be in verse to teach oratory and memorization skills, some to have harder vocabulary as a way to teach students more words, some all of the above. These stories also used to be much darker and dirtier than they are now, with more sanitized versions appearing especially in the Victorian era, but also even in the Middle Ages. And because they were a part of most people's education, they became such a strong cultural touchstone to the point where Europe's first printers used Aesop's fables not just to sustain the literary heritage or offer guidance to the young, but to affirm their own authority as makers of the texts of culture. Also, just a source side note here, I'm going to be quoting this book a lot. The quotes may not be the precise punctuation as they are in the book, and they're not going to have page numbers because I listened to this book via audiobook and took notes based on that, and I wasn't able to find a PDF of the book to be able to search the quotes that I wrote down, so this is what we're going to roll with. Apologies for that, but they are directly quoted regardless. In the late medieval era, with the advent of the printing press, we see primers, initially meant as prayer books for the laity, become useful tools for the education of young people. They often included lists of letters, prayers, and sometimes psalms and scriptural readings as well. And the lists of the alphabet often came along with illustrations of each letter and something for each letter, which would be like a psalm for each one or an animal sound or something else. We also see some of the first books written for children in the latter half of the 15th century, one of the first being the Book of Courtesy, which held different kinds of advice on how to behave, how to have good table manners, and also what things they should and should not be reading. Most books for children at this time were primarily etiquette guides. Stories like Robin Hood, for example, and other adventurous folk tales were often condemned as corrupting for children. When the Reformation happened, most texts that were popular pre-Reformation promptly went out of print, and those that remained in print were primarily shunned and ignored. For post-Reformation England, medieval literature became children's literature. It was associated with childishness, error, sloth, idleness, and foolery. Literature then becomes even more strongly religious and restricted to primers and Chaucer, along with a small handful of other authors after this time, but primarily it was just very dry and very religious, or very dry and information on how to be a good child and apprentice, and not much more. At the end of the 1600s, however, a man named John Locke published some thoughts concerning education, where he talked about how he believed a child's brain is a blank slate waiting to be written upon, and the best way to teach a child is to make it fun and to integrate play into education. He also believed that how children treated animals, those lesser than them, was important to their inner soul, further entrenching Aesop as an educational tool because they were primarily animal stories. And also his overall ideals on education completely changed how teaching worked, and either directly or indirectly created children's literature as we know it today. First of all, because of Robinson Crusoe, which is considered the first English novel and published in 1719, which deeply reflected Lockean values throughout every single piece of it. Robinson Crusoe also brings in the discussion of chapbooks and how, in order to fit Crusoe into chapbooks, it had to be significantly abridged. Chapbooks were cheap, like 4 to 15 page books that you could buy on the street for like I don't know what the currency was, probably like half a penny, like for very, very cheap, just cheap books became chapbooks, and they've been around for quite some time. With Robinson Crusoe specifically, in order to fit Crusoe into chapbooks, it had to be significantly abridged because it was such a long text, and there were many different abridged versions of the story that functionally read more like translations of the work rather than just like cropping out pieces of it. Many of which simplified the language so that any poor person on the street who was maybe a little bit less educated would be able to understand the story and would therefore buy more chapbooks, took out much of the adventure of the story and focused more on learning morals and skill sets, and often leaned more into things around beasts and animals like in the fables. So they then became almost synonymous with children's literature to some degree because by making them easier to understand for less literate folks, they also became significantly easier for young people to understand. The first press explicitly for children's books was founded by John Newbery, who printed his first children's book in 1744, which he sold along with a toy, also in reflection of Lockean principles. By the end of the century, children's books would become a separate group in the publishing industry, and many other London publishers, and eventually publishers elsewhere, would print books specifically for young readers that included things like histories, poems, short stories, nursery rhymes, and fables. The Newbery Medal for Children's Literature, created by the American Library Association in 1922, is named after this John Newbery. The first full-length novel explicitly for children is considered to be The Governess by Sarah Fielding, published in 1749. Also, let's talk about fairy tales for a hot second. Much like things we discussed earlier, fairy tales were not written for children initially. They were instead primarily written, usually based on old folk stories, as fables for aristocracy. But fairy tales, as we know them now, are really the creation of literate collectors, editors, and authors working from the late 17th until the mid-19th century. They appeared as literary texts during the age of Louis XIV, not so much as children's stories, but as exemplary fables for the courtier adults. They taught ideal behavior. They became the fashion of aristocratic salons. If I understand correctly, the idea of fairy tales and other folk tales as children's stories started to really appear in the late 1700s and early 1800s-ish, around the time the Brothers Grimm were collating and publishing their volumes of fairy tales. I would assume in line with like, well, all other fables are sort of viewed as children's stories because we all learned them as kids in school, and these aren't that different from those thought process, but that's just a theory that I have, and I could be entirely wrong about all of the things I just said. But one thing that I did think was interesting is around this era we see increased industrialization, and thus child raising began to look differently. People were moving to cities. They were buying things instead of making them for themselves. Children were working in factories. Love-based and permissive parenting became the style, and blended families were becoming more common, something that we see reflected in the Brothers Grimm idea of the evil stepmother or of a single father raising his children. The Brothers Grimm also often added a lot more Christian morality aspects to their versions of these stories, and around this time and throughout the 1800s we also see more children's stories around colonialism, imperialism, war, and conquering things. As we enter the Victorian era, we get Charles Darwin and the theory of evolution, which really emphasize social ideas of a sense of wonder, of curiosity, of science, and of the fact that things may exist we could never even dream of. We also get this idea of nonsense as creativity, the idea of nonsense as a force of the imagination, of nonsense as a challenge to the logic of adulthood and the laws of civil life. This was a new idea in Victorian England. This idea that there are new things we do not know about, that we get to pick words for things, and that there is a story behind where each word comes from, felt almost Edenic to some degree, returning us to a time of innocence and curiosity before there was language, and childhood in this time became viewed as a time when innocence should be protected, and curiosity is something to encourage. So we get your Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, your Edward Lear, Peter Pan, Tom Sawyer, The Little Princess, and The Secret Garden as some examples from this time. We also see a shift in how girls appear in stories. Traditionally they existed to be vulnerable to scary men or to be some sort of tempting danger themselves, but in this era we see, as girls are no longer getting married as young and are just as expected to go to school as the boys are, we see girlhood appear as a separate identity, with many of the stories about girls focused on reading and on theatricality. Anne of Green Gables appears a little bit after the Victorian era, but it very much embodies this idea. The Edwardian era and Rooseveltian America held on to much of these ideas and ideals of the Victorian era, but there's also a shift after Victoria's death into interest in spookier, darker things and the supernatural, as well as in holiday rituals like that of Christmas and Halloween, so we see a lot of books that take place during those two times of the year. This is also the last era before anybody knew what a world war was, and so there's some aspect of longing and nostalgia that goes along with this. Lehrer noted in his book that the view of an idealistic childhood in literature is more or less trapped in the Edwardian era. The design of children's books as we know them today is also rooted in this era. This is a time where there was a lot of focus on the welfare of children, such as free school meals and the passage of child labor laws. We also see new innovation find its way into children's books, often turning machines and transportation technology like trains and cars into creatures that sort of replace what animals were in older fairy tales and fables. Also, during the Victorian and Edwardian eras in the United States, we see the strong increase in public libraries who, being the primary distributors of children's literature, get to sort of decide what children's literature literature actually was, which then became even stronger in the 1920s with the creation of the Newbery Medal, and also 16 years later, the Caldecott Medal was created for illustration. The First World War didn't necessarily majorly change the literary style of the Victorian and Edwardian eras, but there was a sort of added urgency to it. A greater emphasis on protecting children's innocence through fictional diversions, transporting young audiences to a different world not afflicted with war and violence. We also see more undercurrents of patriotism, pro-imperialism, and reinforcing traditional gender roles and other social ideas. So basically just propaganda. Things changed during the Second World War because it became a lot harder to try and distract children from, especially in the US and the UK, and kids were inherently involved in the support the war effort patriotism going on during this era beyond like air raid drills and everything else. So instead, stories shifted to being more politically adventurous tales about defeating the bad guys, which are often just explicitly the Germans or the Japanese. One book that I found in an article had an anthropomorphized anti-aircraft balloon in it, and even many seemingly non-war related stories were inherently war related. One example spoken about in children's literature was Make Way for Ducklings, published in 1941, where its message is that the father leaves but he comes home when he says that he's going to, that a mother can raise her children on her own, and that no matter what goes on elsewhere in the world, there will always be policemen who help families cross the street and gardens in which to relax. The entire world is not completely turned on its head. There's also Curious George, who is a refugee, written by a married Jewish couple who had escaped the Nazis on handmade bikes. Post-war, or rather during the Cold War, there were fears that the US may be falling behind the USSR in education, so there was a re-evaluation of books used in classrooms and a deliberate choice to not use the so-called uptight classics as much, and instead use ones that were more fun and engaging, like Dr. Seuss, for example. The next era most sources talk about in regards to children's literature, and usually the last one for some reason, is the 1970s, where there was more of a societal change in using children's stories to realize that children can understand things like irony and transgression, and starting to challenge the status quo. So we get like Judy Blume talking about periods, or Harriet the Spy maybe not being the nicest all the time. A lot more stories were also happening in cities. We see the creation of the young adult genre in the late 60s in response to rising media centering teen protagonists, and stories get a lot less fantastical and a lot more realistic. Now, I can't really speak for between the 1970s and the current present day because very few sources cover it for some reason, beyond the fact that Harry Potter completely revolutionized the children's book and fantasy publishing realms, but also I'm not going to talk about Harry Potter. But one thing that I will say is that in that time we have seen a rise in the inclusion of deliberate diversity in our children's books. Specifically with disability, there was a huge boom in disability inclusive stories as a result of deinstitutionalization, and especially after 1986 when the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, was passed, which integrated disabled children into the mainstream schooling system. Not necessarily super effective all the time. That's a conversation for another day. I'll link a video above, but as more and more students are starting to see disabled children in their classrooms, we see an increase in books including disabled characters. After this initial wave of disability inclusion, we then saw a second wave of inclusion of more invisible disabilities like dyslexia, intellectual disability, and even things like social anxiety. But because of the nature of where these stories came from, they're usually about disability rather than about something else that happened to have a disabled character in them, and they're also usually written to teach a non-disabled audience about disability rather than be representation for disabled children. This has changed in the last 10 or so years. I think everybody got really tired of the early 2010s trend of middle grade inspiration porn stories like Wonder and Counting by Sevens and started to create something different. And there's also more work towards trying to print own voices stories, which inherently feel more like own voices stories because that's what they are. Earlier disability representation in children's books is incredibly frequent. Nearly every fairy tale involves it somehow, often as a metaphor rather than a lived experience, and typically something that is cured by spiritual discipline or otherwise doing the right thing and learning a lesson, which is complicated because for much of history, disability was not a social category that really became a thing in the mid-1800s with the rise of capitalism and industrialization. I will link some video above where I talk about the history of where disability as a category came from. I don't know when I most recently talked about it, but I talk about it literally all the time. Usually comes up in like every single dramaturgy video I do. But what we might consider to be disability representation in earlier stories, and really stories well into the late 1800s, looks very different inherently. First, because many people were sick all the time, and that was just kind of factored into most stories as a normal part of day-to-day life, so the threshold for disabled enough to be of note was a lot higher than it is today. But second of all, because disabled people were sort of separated into distinct categories of the mad, the crippled, the deformed, the deaf, the mute, and or the blind, and the idea of representation and of a large grouping of disability was not really a thing yet. Over the course of the 19th century, as the disability category became stronger, the prevailing conception of disability of the time was of a fixed, divinely ordained state of being, viewed as having a global influence on the life of the disabled person. The disabled person was regarded as set apart from the rest of society by his or her disability. This increase stories and association between disability as a sort of identity marker created more stories that linked disability with moral character, either as the evil villain or the saintly frail child, and the disabled were either elderly people or they do not make it to adulthood, either because they die young or because they are cured. And because, as we talked about earlier, Victorian and Edwardian children's stories are generally the ones that we see as classics today, these narratives continue to stick around really strongly in today's literature and overall media. Not to mention that these are the narratives of disability that the majority of generations alive today learned as children, and thus completely shaped how they view the world and themselves and their relationship to it, which becomes a lot harder to unpack in somebody later in life than a random story they heard once on the street when they were 30. But it's important to note that not all literature in this time around disability was so stereotyped in one note. One article I read noted that many of the more out-of-print texts had more complicated and varied views of disability, and there is something to be discussed as to why these stereotype texts survive and why the nuanced ones did not, that might indicate what kinds of stories people want to believe about disability. Which, if we remember that storytelling fundamentally exists to explain the unexplainable, or at least that's one of the primary reasons I believe humans tell stories, and thus why things that are unknown take up so much of the literary canon, it makes sense that something like disability, which very much impacts the way that you live your life and probably the people around you live their lives, is going to be a focal point of that. It also makes sense that in the 20th century, earlier stories that make disability treatable and palatable and somewhat explainable are going to last longer as asylums became normalized, and thus the visible presence of disability became atypical and thus needed to be explained and justified because of how odd it suddenly was. In regards to disabled representation in famous children's book authors, I wasn't able to find very much information about that, unfortunately, which made me really sad. There is Hans Christian Andersen, who in particular wrote interesting things about disability. His stories often explicitly noted power imbalances between disabled and not disabled, and indicated that someone's place in the social hierarchy was somewhat decided by their actual or perceived disability. See The Ugly Duckling, for example. And I find that particularly interesting because he's widely agreed upon today as having been an autistic person. But if you know of any other historical children's books written by disabled people, please let me know. In more recent history, we have Patricia Polacco, who I believe was dyslexic. She wrote about disability frequently. We also have the Hank Zipser series by Henry Winkler, is written about an ADHD and dyslexic kid, if I remember correctly, that is more or less autobiographical from Henry Winkler, but I don't know about historical stuff. I want to know more about historical stuff. I think that that is interesting, so if you know those things, please let me know. I feel like if I read the Wikipedia page of every single famous children's book author, I could find a bunch of them, but there's no like collated list that exists, so I haven't. That's a project for another day. I will also briefly mention that so many of our favorite children's books are written by queer people and are deliberately implicitly queer. That is not really my vein of study, so I decided to not include it in this video, but the lovely Kaz Rowe made a video about that, which I'll link at the top of the description for you, and you should definitely check it out. If you want recommendations on finding children's books with good disability representation, I do have a disability media representation recommendations list on my website organized by category. Most of the children's books on there are written by disabled authors. Also, the Catchpoles, both disabled authors themselves as well as a literary agency, have tons of recommendations and resources as well on their website, which I will also link below for you as well. But otherwise, I think I'm going to leave this one here. I hope that you found it interesting, and let me know below what your favorite children's books are or were growing up. I will say for me, off the top of my head, Frog and Toad, Anne of Green Gables, Curious George, Ferdinand, literally any book by Patricia Polacco, I would die for her, and Mike Mulligan and his steam shovel. I like that one a lot. And as always, thank you for listening, thank you for learning, remember it's never too late to start over, and critical thinking is really sexy, and I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.